The darkness of the outer reach stretched endlessly in all directions. No ships came here. No colonies existed in this cursed sector of space. For 300 years, the galactic community had avoided this place after entire fleets disappeared without sending a single distress call. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the occasional cosmic radiation that swept through the void like invisible waves. Commander Hyun-woo stood on the bridge of his research vessel, watching the scanning displays with tired eyes. His mission was simple: study gravitational anomalies at the edge of the reach, collect data, and return home to the Talveen Empire. Nothing exciting, nothing dangerous. Just routine scientific work that would probably earn him a footnote in some academic journal that nobody would read. Beside him, Science Officer Mireille adjusted her sensors for the third time that hour. She was thorough. Perhaps too thorough, always double-checking everything. The pilot Jinho sat at his console, keeping the ship steady while monitoring fuel consumption. In the medical bay below, Subin organized her supplies, hoping she wouldn't need to use any of them. They were a small crew, just 4 people on a small ship, doing small work in the vast emptiness of space. The alarm changed everything. A soft beeping sound that made Mireille lean forward, her eyes widening as she studied her screens. Hyun-woo moved to her station immediately, years of training overriding his fatigue. What he saw made no sense. The sensors showed something massive drifting through the void, something that shouldn't exist in this dead sector of space. A ship, enormous, silent, completely dark except for the faint heat signature that suggested some systems still held residual power after years of being inactive. The design was unlike anything in the galactic database, angular and brutal, covered in symbols that the computer couldn't translate. The hull showed damage that should have torn any known vessel apart, weapon burns that should have vaporized metal, hull breaches sealed with crude patches, and strangest of all, absolutely no life signs. Hyun-woo made the decision quickly. Protocol said to report the finding and wait for a military vessel to investigate. But Protocol also said nothing should exist here, and this ship, this impossible ship, might hold answers to questions the galactic community had been asking for centuries. He ordered Jinho to bring them alongside the derelict. He told Mireille to prepare scanning equipment. He informed Subin that they might need medical supplies, though for what, he couldn't say. The airlock connection took 20 minutes. The derelict's hull was thick, far thicker than necessary for any normal vessel. When the seal finally engaged and the door opened, they entered a corridor that smelled of stale air and old metal. Emergency lights flickered on as they moved forward, responding to their presence with systems that shouldn't still function after so long in the void. The walls were lined with weapons, not energy weapons or plasma cannons, but simple kinetic systems, projectile weapons that threw metal slugs using chemical explosives. Primitive technology that no advanced civilization had used in thousands of years. Jinho touched a wall and pulled his hand back quickly. The metal was scarred with deep grooves, as if something with claws had tried to tear through it. Dark stains covered the floor in places. Mireille's scanner identified them as biological matter. Blood from multiple species, some of it belonging to the ship's original crew, some of it belonging to something else. Whatever happened here had been violent, close combat in narrow corridors where advanced weapons would be useless and only brutal strength would matter. They found the crew quarters first, small rooms with simple bunks, personal items still secured in lockers. Pictures of a blue world with green continents and white clouds. Images of bipedal beings that looked similar to several galactic species, but with subtle differences. Stronger bone structure, denser muscle tissue, based on the gravity calculations Mireille was running. These beings had evolved on a heavy world, a place where simply standing upright required more strength than most species possessed. The bridge was at the center of the ship, protected by multiple sealed doors that had to be manually opened. When they finally entered, they found the crew. 7 bodies, still strapped into their stations, dead for what the medical scanner estimated at 270 years. They hadn't died from violence. They had died from simple system failure. Their air had run out. Their heat had failed. And they had died at their posts, rather than abandon their duty. Mireille approached the central console carefully. The data core was still intact, still holding power from some internal source that her scanner couldn't identify. When she connected her equipment, the bridge came to life. Lights flickered on, displays activated, and a recorded message began to play. The language was unknown. Harsh sounds that the translation matrix struggled to process. But slowly, word by word, the meaning became clear. The hologram showed a man in a tattered uniform. Blood stained his face. Exhaustion made his eyes hollow. But his voice was steady as he spoke. He identified himself as Captain Doyun of the Terran defense ship Indomitable. He explained that if anyone was hearing this message, humanity's last stand had failed. But they had not surrendered. They had not gone quietly into extinction. The recording showed images that made Hyunwoo's crew step back in horror. A blue world under siege. Massive ships descending from orbit. Harvesting everything. Cities burning. Billions dying. A species called the Architects. Cybernetic beings that consumed organic worlds for raw materials. Had found Earth. Humanity fought for 15 years with primitive weapons against an enemy that was thousands of years more advanced. They lost every major battle. They were outgunned and outnumbered in every engagement. But they kept fighting. The Indomitable was humanity's final hope. A colony ship, disguised as a warship, carrying 10,000 humans in cryostasis. The plan was simple. Let Earth burn as a distraction while the Indomitable escaped to find a new home among the stars. But the Architects found them. The battle lasted 6 hours. Every crew member died defending the sleeper bay. Captain Doyun sealed the bay with the last of the ship's power and set the vessel adrift, hoping that someone, someday, would find them and give humanity a second chance. Hyunwoo stood in silence as the recording ended. Behind him, Subin was crying quietly. Jinho gripped his weapon with white knuckles. Mireille was already running scans on the ship's aft section, searching for the sleeper bay. When she found it, her voice was barely a whisper. The bay was intact. The cryosystems were still running on emergency power. And inside, 10,000 humans waited in frozen sleep, unaware that their entire species had been wiped out centuries ago. They had found humanity's ark, and now they had to decide what to do with it. The message traveled through quantum channels at faster than light speed, reaching Talveen High Command within hours. The response was immediate and predictable. Secure the vessel, prevent any contamination, and wait for a military fleet to arrive. Under no circumstances should the crew attempt to interact with the cryosystems. The sleepers would remain frozen until proper quarantine facilities could be established and full analysis completed. Standard protocol for unknown biological entities. Safe, careful, reasonable. Mireille discovered the problem 36 hours after sending the initial report. The cryosystems were failing. Not catastrophically, but steadily. Power cells that had lasted for centuries were finally dying. Temperature fluctuations were beginning in the outer pods. Within 70 hours, maybe less, the backup systems would fail completely. The humans would die in their sleep, never knowing how close they had come to survival. Hyunwoo read the report 3 times before making his decision. The military fleet wouldn't arrive for another 5 days. High Command would order them to wait, to let the proper authorities handle the situation. But proper authorities would arrive to find 10,000 corpses instead of 10,000 survivors. He had joined the Talveen Science Division to discover new things, to help people, to make the galaxy better. This was his chance to actually do something that mattered. He ordered Mireille to begin revival procedures on the first pod. Subin prepared the medical bay for unknown biological responses. Jinho stood guard with a weapon he hoped he wouldn't need to use. They chose a pod near the center of the bay, where the systems were most stable. The woman inside looked peaceful, Her face relaxed in artificial sleep. According to the ship's database that Mireille had partially decrypted, her name was Borum, former military engineer. Age 32, when she entered cryosleep. She had volunteered to stay awake until the last possible moment, helping others into their pods before taking her own place. The revival process took 4 hours. Her body temperature rose slowly. Her heart began beating on its own. Brain activity increased from minimal to normal ranges. Her eyes opened suddenly. And everything went wrong. She moved faster than any of them expected, tearing the medical connections from her arms and lunging at Mireille, with hands that were definitely trying to kill. She was screaming words in her language, words that the translator identified as threats and curses. Jinho tried to restrain her, but she fought with a skill that spoke of serious military training. She was weak from centuries of sleep, malnourished and disoriented, but she was still dangerous. Subin had to sedate her. It took 3 times the normal dose for a being of her size. Even unconscious, her body fought the drugs. When she finally went still, Subin ran a full biological scan and found something that made her call Hyun Woo immediately. This woman was built for survival. Dense bones, efficient organs, an immune system that was already adapting to the sedative. Genetic markers that suggested her ancestors had survived countless diseases and environmental pressures. She had evolved on a world that tried to kill her every day, and her body showed it. When Borum woke again, she was restrained on a medical bed, with Hyun Woo sitting nearby, his hands visible and empty. He spoke slowly, letting the translator process his words into her language. He explained that she was safe, that the architects were gone, that she had been asleep for 274 years, that Earth was destroyed, that everyone she knew was dead, that humanity was extinct, except for the people sleeping in the Indomitable's bay. She didn't cry. She stared at the ceiling for a long time. Her jaw clenched tight. Then, she asked questions. Clear, direct questions about the current galactic situation, about Talveen technology, about the status of the ship's systems, about the other sleepers. She processed information like a computer, filing away facts and building a mental picture of her new reality. When Hyun Woo finally released her restraints, she sat up slowly and said one thing in broken Talveen that the translator didn't need to process. Wake the others. Wake the others. They woke 10 more humans over the next 2 days. Each revival was traumatic. Each human went through the same stages: confusion, violence, grief, acceptance. But the acceptance came faster than Hyun Woo expected. These people mourned quickly and quietly, then immediately began working. They checked systems. They repaired damage. They made plans. It was disturbing to watch how quickly they moved from despair to action. Taejin was a soldier who had fought in the final defense of a city called Seoul. He had watched billions die and kept fighting anyway. Now he studied Talveen weapons with intense focus, understanding their principles within hours. Eunji was a physician who had treated casualties during the evacuation. She had failed to save millions. Now she worked in the medical bay alongside Subin, learning alien medicine while teaching human techniques. Kyungmin was young, barely 20 when she entered cryosleep, a pilot who had flown suicide missions to buy evacuation time. Now she sat in the Indomitable's pilot chair, testing systems that hadn't been active in centuries. Subin couldn't understand it. She ran psychological evaluations on all of them and found the same pattern. They should be broken. They had lost everything: their world, their civilization, their families. Everyone they loved was dust. But instead of collapsing, they were building. She asked Borum about it during one of their medical sessions. Borum's answer was simple and terrifying. We're human. We don't know how to quit. It's not in our genes. The military fleet arrived on schedule. 3 massive warships that dwarfed the Indomitable completely. Fleet Admiral Jiho was a career officer who followed regulations perfectly. He reviewed the situation, noted Hyun Woo's violation of direct orders, and then made his own decision. The humans would be transferred to quarantine facilities for integration processing. It was policy. It was safe. It was the right thing to do for everyone involved. Boram disagreed. She stood in the Indomitable's cargo bay with 10 other humans behind her, facing the Talveen admiral, with an expression that made Jinho grip his weapon nervously. She spoke in halting Talveen, having learned enough of the language to make herself clear. She explained that humans had not survived extinction just to become wards of another species. They would rebuild. They would adapt. They would earn their place among the stars, with Talveen help or without it. They were grateful for the rescue, but they would not surrender their independence. Not after fighting so hard to preserve it. Admiral Jiho was accustomed to compliance. Every species in the galactic community understood the hierarchy. Advanced species guided primitive ones. It was natural. It was logical. It was how civilization worked. These humans were refugees, who should be grateful for any help offered. Their defiance made no sense. Then Tejan showed them the black box recordings. The final battle of the Indomitable. 6 hours of humans in simple exosuits, fighting cybernetic monsters in close combat. Pilots ramming ships that cost more than entire planetary economies. Engineers sealing hull breaches with their own bodies. The crew of the Indomitable dying one by one, buying seconds and minutes with their lives so that their sleeping passengers might survive. The Talveen officers watched in silence. They had never seen anything like it. Military doctrine said you retreated when defeat was certain. You preserved forces for future engagements. You made logical decisions based on probability of success. These humans ignored all of that. They fought when fighting was pointless. They died when surrender would have saved them. They kept going long past the moment when any reasonable species would have given up. Admiral Jiho looked at Boram with new understanding. These weren't victims. They were survivors. And perhaps something more dangerous than he had initially realized. The Galactic Council chamber was enormous, designed to accommodate representatives from 5 major species and dozens of minor ones. Today, it felt cramped, as counselors argued about what to do with humanity. The debate had been going for 6 hours without resolution, and tempers were rising. The Ven representative spoke first. Its cybernetic voice flat and emotionless. Humans should be classified as a labor class. They were primitive, but potentially useful. Their physical strength and durability made them suitable for dangerous work that other species avoided. Give them basic rights, basic education, and basic living conditions. They would serve the galactic economy and be grateful for the opportunity. The Korath counselor disagreed loudly, his reptilian features twisted in concern. Humans were dangerous. Their psychology was unpredictable. They fought beyond logic and refused to accept defeat, even when defeat was certain. Such a species needed strict monitoring, limited reproduction rights, controlled settlement areas. They could not be allowed to spread freely through galactic space. History showed what happened when violent species gained advanced technology. The Helion representative, a being of pure energy contained in a crystalline matrix, offered a different perspective. Humans were fascinating. They were flames that refused to dim, even in darkness. They possessed something that most galactic species had lost: the ability to hope when hope was irrational. This quality should be studied. Perhaps cultivated. The Helions voted for full research access and extended observation. The Korath hive mind wanted to understand human biology. Their species had never encountered anything quite like humanity. Evolution on a death world produced interesting adaptations. The Korath requested samples, genetic material, detailed medical data. They promised humane treatment and valuable insights in exchange. Their intentions were scientific, not malicious. But the casual way they discussed humans, like laboratory specimens, made several counselors uncomfortable. Only Counselor Nari of the Talveen argued for full sovereignty. She stood before the council with documents and data, presenting her case with careful precision. Humans had survived their own extinction. They had demonstrated technological innovation, military capability, and social cohesion under impossible conditions. They deserved the chance to determine their own fate. To treat them as anything less would be morally wrong and practically foolish. A species that had fought the architects to a standstill, even in defeat, was not one to underestimate or alienate. While politicians debated in comfortable chambers, humans worked. The Talveen had provided a small facility on their homeworld's moon as temporary housing. It was meant to hold a few hundred refugees in basic comfort. 8,000 humans had been awakened from the indomitable now, and they had transformed the facility into something else entirely, something that made the Talveen engineers deeply uncomfortable. Boram led the engineering teams personally. She studied Talveen technology with intense focus, understanding principles in hours that should have taken months. Then she began combining human design philosophy with alien systems. The results were crude, but effective. Power systems that were inefficient, but incredibly durable. Hull plating that was heavy but nearly indestructible. Weapon mounts that could handle both human kinetic weapons and Talveen energy systems. The hybrid designs violated several engineering principles that the Talveen considered fundamental, but they worked. Yunji established a medical clinic that treated both humans and Talveen. She learned alien physiology quickly, adapting human medical techniques to different biology. Soon, Talveen workers were coming to her facility instead of their own doctors, finding that her direct approach and willingness to experiment produced faster results. She earned trust through competence, proving that human medicine wasn't inferior, just different. Kyungmin trained on Talveen fighter craft, and her instructors didn't know what to make of her. She mastered the controls in a fraction of the expected time. Her spatial awareness was uncanny. Her reaction speed was faster than any Talveen pilot. But her tactics were terrifying. She flew aggressively, taking risks that no sane pilot would attempt. She used maneuvers that simulation computers labeled as suicide runs. And she succeeded anyway, threading through impossible gaps and pulling turns that should have killed her. Cultural tensions grew. Some Talveen saw humans as primitives who needed guidance. They offered advice that was really orders. They suggested changes that were really demands. They smiled and spoke softly. But the message was clear. Adapt to our ways, or remain outsiders. Some humans resented this attitude. Town readable, when we could wan within his nake. Town with a town readable. Town with a noun within. Town with a noun with a noun with a noun with a noun. They had fought too hard and lost too much to accept condescension from species that had never faced true existential threat. The breaking point came during a joint training exercise. A Talveen officer named Minho criticized human tactics as wasteful and suicidal. He said it loudly in front of mixed troops, clearly intending to humiliate. Taejin responded by challenging him to a combat simulation. Standard rules, standard equipment, victory conditions based on objective completion, not survival. The fight lasted 8 minutes. Taejin won brutally. He used terrain that Minho ignored. He sacrificed shield power for speed. He took damage that made observers flinch, and he completed the objective while Minho was still trying to engage safely. The simulation computer analyzed the results and labeled Taejin's approach as unnecessarily aggressive, with unacceptably high risk factors, but it had worked. That was the part nobody could argue with. The incident forced a confrontation. Hyun-woo visited the human settlement personally, something he did often now. He had become something of a liaison between species, trusted by both sides. He found Boram in the engineering bay, working on a hybrid power system that probably violated 3 safety regulations. He asked her directly what humanity wanted. What was their goal? What would make them accept their place in galactic society? Boram stopped working and looked at him. Her answer was simple and uncompromising. Humans wanted to never be victims again. They wanted to become strong enough that no one could erase them. They would earn their place through work and contribution. They would follow reasonable laws and respect other species. But they would not kneel. They would not accept being treated as lesser beings who needed constant supervision. They had survived too much to accept that kind of existence. Hyun-woo understood. He returned to Talveen High Command and made his report. He recommended full sovereignty be granted immediately. The council ignored him. They wanted more data, more observation, more time to make the correct decision through proper channels. While they debated, Woo Jin worked in shadows. He was a Ven intelligence officer, part cybernetic and part organic, assigned to monitor deep space sensor networks. He noticed anomalies that others missed, scanning patterns at the edge of explored space. Energy signatures that matched old database entries from centuries ago. The patterns were familiar, too familiar. He ran analysis after analysis, hoping he was wrong. He wasn't wrong. The architects had returned. They were searching for something in the outer reach. Projections suggested they were tracking a specific energy signature, the kind of signature that cryobay power systems produced. They were hunting for the indomitable. They were hunting for humanity's survivors. And they would reach Talveen space within a year. Woojin brought his findings to Counselor Nari. She brought them to the full council. Panic spread through the chamber. The architects hadn't been seen in 3 centuries. They had harvested 12 worlds and vanished, presumably moving to other galaxies. Their return meant every species in the council was at risk. Standard defensive measures had never worked against them. Traditional tactics were useless. The council's combined military might have never faced anything like the architects, and had no proven strategies. The question became urgent. Would the Galactic Council accept humanity as allies before humanity's ancient enemy found them again? And more importantly, could humans actually help against an enemy that had destroyed their entire civilization? 6 months after humanity's awakening, New Terra looked less like a refugee camp and more like a settlement. The prefabricated structures had been reinforced with human modifications. Hydroponic farms produced food using hybrid techniques that combined Talveen efficiency with human agricultural knowledge. A small shipyard occupied the crater where the Indomitable had been carefully landed, its bulk now serving as both memorial and resource. 8,000 humans had made this moon their home, and they were building something that would last. Boram stood in what humans called the command center, reviewing reports that made her tired. Resource allocation, construction schedules, trade agreements with Talveen suppliers, the mundane work of building a civilization from nothing. She had been a military engineer, trained to destroy things efficiently. Now she was learning to build them instead. The irony wasn't lost on her. When Woojin's report went public, everything changed. The sensor data was undeniable. The architects were in the outer reach, moving through dead space in a search pattern. They were looking for something specific. Advanced probability analysis suggested they were tracking the Indomitable's power signature, following a trail that was centuries old but still detectable with the right equipment. Within a year, maybe less, they would reach Talveen space. The Galactic Council's response was predictable and useless. Emergency sessions produced defensive strategies that had never worked before. Fortify core worlds. Evacuate outer colonies. Prepare civilian populations for possible harvesting operations. Build bunkers that might buy hours instead of days. Standard procedures for facing an unstoppable enemy. Delay the inevitable and hope for a miracle. Taejin approached Fleet Admiral Jiho with a different idea. The meeting was informal, held in the Admiral's office rather than a conference room. Taejin wore simple clothing, carried no weapons, and spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced death many times and stopped being afraid of it. His proposal was simple. Let humans fight. Admiral Jiho's first response was disbelief. Humanity numbered barely 8,000. They had no fleet, limited resources, and technology that was primitive by galactic standards. The architects had destroyed their entire civilization when humanity was at full strength with billions of soldiers and thousands of warships. What could refugees possibly offer against that kind of enemy? Taejin's response was patient. He explained that humans knew how to fight architects. They had killed them before. They understood architect tactics, their weaknesses, their blind spots. The galactic community had never faced them. Every strategy the Council was planning was based on fighting conventional enemies. The architects were not conventional. They were cybernetic hive minds that adapted faster than organic intelligences could react. Standard military doctrine was worse than useless against them. Yunji provided medical evidence. She had spent months studying the differences between human and Talveen neurology. Human brains were chaotic compared to other species. Neural patterns that seemed inefficient were actually incredibly adaptable. This chaos made humans resistant to architect hacking protocols. The cybernetic intelligence that could override Talveen or Korith or Ven nervous systems couldn't easily control human brains. They were too unpredictable, too organic, too messy. During Earth's final years, humans had learned this advantage and used it. Boarding actions, close combat, fighting in ways that minimized the architect's technological superiority. Kyungmin demonstrated combat maneuvers in simulations. She showed tactics designed specifically to counter architect fighter swarms. Patterns learned through blood and desperation during Earth's last battles. The maneuvers looked insane to Talveen observers. They involved flying through crossfire, using enemy vessels as shields, sacrificing defensive capability for speed and positioning. The simulation computers labeled them as high risk with low survival probability, but they worked against architect formations in ways that conventional tactics didn't. Borum revealed humanity's final weapon. Before Earth fell, human military scientists had developed something called the Havoc Protocol. It was part computer virus, part electromagnetic pulse, part quantum paradox. Designed to cascade through architect networks and create catastrophic system failures, the theory was sound. The mathematics were elegant. It had never been tested because Earth burned before deployment could happen. But the complete schematics had survived on the Indomitable's data cores. The presentation lasted 4 hours. When it ended, Admiral Jiho sat in silence, processing what he had learned. These refugees were offering to fight an enemy that had destroyed them once. They were proposing tactics that violated every principle of safe military engagement. They wanted to deploy an untested weapon that might not work, and somehow, listening to them, he believed they might actually succeed. The Galactic Council met in emergency session. Councillor Nari presented the human proposal with full technical documentation. The debate was fierce. The Korith councillor argued that trusting human tactics was foolish desperation. The Ven representative calculated probability of success at less than 15%. The Korith wanted more testing time. The Helion observer simply noted that sometimes flames were the only answer to darkness. Councillor Nari broke the deadlock with a political maneuver that would define her career. She called for a vote not on full sovereignty, but on provisional military alliance status. Humans would serve as advisors and specialists during the crisis. In exchange, they would receive full construction rights to their settlement and unrestricted access to galactic technology databases. Not independence, but a foundation to build toward it. The vote passed. Barely. The Korith councillor abstained rather than vote against it. The Ven representative voted yes, only after calculating that any advantage was better than none against the architects. But it passed, and that was enough. Human engineers began working with Talveen military scientists immediately. The Havoc Protocol required adaptation to work with galactic technology. Human systems used different principles than Talveen computers. The integration was complex and time-consuming. They had months to accomplish work that should take years. Boram drove her teams hard. 18-hour workdays became normal. Humans and Talveen worked side by side, learning from each other. The language barriers faded as technical jargon became universal. Coffee, a human stimulant, became popular among Talveen engineers who discovered it kept them alert during long sessions. Human music played in work areas. Strange rhythms that somehow helped concentration. One evening, Mireille found Borum on the observation deck of New Terra, staring at the stars. The Talveen science officer had become a friend during the months of cooperation. She asked the question that troubled her. Did Borum really think they could stop the architects? Borum was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of memory. She talked about the last days of Earth, about watching cities burn, about knowing that defeat was certain but fighting anyway, about the moment she climbed into her cryopod, believing she would never wake up. She talked about Captain Doyun, who had stayed at his post until the air ran out, making sure everyone else had a chance to survive. Then she talked about now, about having allies instead of facing the enemy alone, about having better technology than simple kinetic weapons, about having time to prepare instead of fighting a desperate delaying action. Most importantly, about having a reason to fight that went beyond simple survival. Now they had a chance for something humans rarely got: revenge. In the darkness of space, the Architect fleet advanced steadily, following a signal they had detected years ago. 300 harvester ships moved in perfect formation, directed by a central intelligence that had never known defeat. They were searching for a vessel that had escaped them centuries before, a loose end that needed to be eliminated. They had no reason to expect resistance. Organic species always ran or died. It was the pattern of the universe. They were about to learn that some species didn't follow patterns, and some survivors didn't forget. The Architect fleet emerged at the edge of Talveen space like a wound opening in reality. 300 ships materialized from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation, their hulls dark and silent. At the center floated the Apex, a moon-sized fortress that commanded the entire fleet through quantum-linked consciousness. Sensors across the Talveen system screamed warnings. Every military base went to maximum alert. Civilian populations began evacuation procedures that everyone knew were pointless. You couldn't outrun the Architects. History had proven that. The Galactic Council's combined fleet assembled in the Talveen system's asteroid belt. 800 warships from 5 different species, representing the largest military force ever gathered. Korath dreadnoughts bristled with plasma weapons. Ven cruisers carried cyber warfare systems. Talveen carriers launched fighter squadrons. Korath science vessels positioned for battlefield analysis. Helion energy projectors charged to maximum output. On paper, it was an overwhelming force. Intelligence analysis gave them a 30% chance of victory. 30% was generous. The Architects had never lost. Humanity's contribution looked pathetic by comparison. 12 modified strike craft, each carrying a pilot who had learned to fly in Earth's final desperate battles. The rebuilt Indomitable, its hull patched and reinforced, serving as a command vessel despite systems that were centuries outdated. 100 orbital mines disguised as asteroid debris, each carrying a fragment of the Havoc protocol, against 300 harvester ships and a fortress that could destroy planets. It seemed laughably inadequate. Borum stood on the Indomitable's bridge, watching the tactical displays. Around her, human and Talveen crew worked together at stations that had been dead for centuries. Jinho piloted the ship with Kyungmin as his co-pilot, their different styles merging into something more effective than either alone. Mireille coordinated sensor data, feeding information to both human and galactic forces. Hyun-woo served as communication officer, translating between species and command structures. They were an impossible crew on an impossible ship, about to attempt an impossible task. The battle began with traditional tactics. The Galactic fleet engaged at maximum range, attempting to destroy Architect ships before they could close distance. Plasma fire and energy weapons lit up the void. The Architects responded with precise counterfire, their networked intelligence allowing perfect coordination. Within minutes, Galactic ships began dying. The Architects adapted to every tactic faster than organic commanders could adjust. They exploited every weakness. They targeted command vessels first, disrupting coordination. They used captured technology against its creators. 2 hours into the battle, The Galactic Fleet had lost 40 ships. The Architects had lost 3. The mathematics of extinction became clear. At this rate, complete defeat would come within 6 hours. Admiral Jiho prepared fallback orders, knowing they were meaningless. You couldn't fall back from an enemy that consumed entire worlds. Taejin's voice cut through command channels with calm authority. He transmitted one word in multiple languages. Now, the human strike craft launched. 12 fighters against hundreds of Architect vessels. They didn't attack. They maneuvered. Kyungmin led them in patterns that looked random, but were carefully calculated. They dove through crossfire that destroyed 3 Talveen fighters in the same space. They used asteroid gravity wells for impossible turns. They sacrificed shields for speed, armor for positioning. The Architect fleet tracked them, analyzed them, dismissed them as insignificant. That was the mistake. The strike craft weren't attacking. They were herding. They forced Architect fighters to adjust formation. They drew ships away from defensive positions. They created gaps in coverage that looked accidental. And slowly, precisely, they compressed the Architect fighter swarm into tighter and tighter formation around their capital ships. When the concentration was perfect, Borum triggered the Havoc protocol. The effect was invisible to normal sensors. It propagated through Architect networks at quantum speeds, a cascading failure that turned their greatest strength into fatal weakness. The hive mind that coordinated 300 ships fractured into thousands of isolated nodes. Each ship suddenly found itself alone, unable to communicate, unable to coordinate. For 17 minutes, the unstoppable force was blind and confused. 17 minutes was all humanity needed. Taejin led boarding teams that had been waiting in assault ships. They hit Architect harvesters while their defenses were down, breaching hulls with shaped charges and entering through wounds in the metal. Inside, they fought with weapons that were primitive by galactic standards but perfect for close quarters. Kinetic rifles that fired solid slugs. Explosive charges that didn't care about shields. Hand weapons that worked when everything electronic failed. Human soldiers moved through Architect vessels like they had trained for this their entire lives. Because they had. Every human over 30 remembered Earth's final battles. They knew Architect ship layouts. They knew where to hit to disable systems. They knew how to fight in zero gravity against cybernetic enemies. The Architects adapted quickly, but humans adapted faster. When technology failed, humans used improvisation. When weapons broke, they used anything available. When armor failed, they used themselves as shields for their squad mates. The Indomitable, piloted by Jinho with precision that shouldn't be possible in such a damaged vessel, rammed directly into an Architect command carrier. The impact should have destroyed both ships. Instead, the Indomitable's primitive but incredibly durable construction punched through advanced shields and buried itself in the carrier's hull. Shaped charges detonated along the impact line. The carrier's shields collapsed, its systems failed, and it became a stationary target for every ship in the Galactic Fleet. Admiral Jiho watched from his flagship, understanding something profound. Humans weren't fighting to win a battle. They were fighting to kill an enemy. The distinction changed everything. Galactic military doctrine focused on objectives, victory conditions, acceptable losses. Human tactics focused on one thing: making the enemy die. They would sacrifice anything, risk everything, use any method available. It wasn't civilized. It wasn't efficient. It was absolutely terrifying. The Galactic Fleet pressed forward with renewed coordination. Korath dreadnoughts unleashed plasma barrages at close range, where they were most effective. Ven ships deployed cyber weapons that exploited the gaps the Havoc protocol had created. Talveen fighters followed human tactics, flying more aggressively than training allowed. The tide turned slowly, purchased with blood and sacrifice, but it turned. The Apex attempted to retreat, its central intelligence recognizing defeat for the first time in its existence. But Unji had discovered something during her months of studying captured Architect drones. Their central intelligence wasn't purely synthetic. At its core was something biological, a harvested brain from some ancient species, augmented with machinery, but still organic. And organic things could be poisoned. Kyungmin's strike team delivered a toxin payload directly into the Apex's systems. The delivery run cost her shields, half her fighter's hull plating, and nearly killed her. But the toxin reached its target. The central intelligence didn't die cleanly. It went insane. Biological neurons firing randomly, while mechanical systems tried to compensate. The Apex began transmitting contradictory orders. It fired on its own ships. It changed course, randomly. The nightmare that had destroyed Earth thrashed in its death throes, and the entire Architect fleet collapsed with it. The battle ended not with glorious victory but with exhaustion. The Galactic fleet had lost 112 vessels and over 2,000 lives. Of the 12 human pilots, 8 survived, all wounded. The Indomitable would never fly again, its hull fractured beyond any repair. But the Architects were broken. For the first time in recorded history, they retreated. The survivors fled into deep space, their formation shattered, their coordination destroyed. In the aftermath, as rescue operations began and casualty reports came in, Borum sat in the Indomitable's ruined bridge. Around her, the bodies of crew members who hadn't survived the final ram attack lay where they had fallen. She had known them all, had worked beside them, had shared coffee and stories during long nights of preparation. Now they were gone, added to the list of humans who had died fighting the Architects, the list that included billions. Hyunwoo found her there hours later. He said nothing, just sat beside her in the darkness. They had both understood from the beginning that war meant death, but understanding and experiencing were different things. After a long silence, Borum spoke quietly. She talked about Captain Do-yoon, who had died at his post, about the billions on Earth who never got to fight back, about the crew of the Indomitable who had sacrificed everything for people they would never meet, and about the 8,000 humans on New Terra who now had a chance to actually live instead of just survive. 3 months later, the Galactic Council convened for the most important vote in its history. Councillor Nari presented the motion personally, standing before representatives who had watched humans fight and die alongside their own people. The motion was simple: full sovereign recognition of humanity as an independent species with territorial rights and council representation. Every species that had lost ships in the battle owed humanity a debt. Every commander who had watched human tactics turn impossible odds had learned respect. The vote was unanimous. New Terra became officially recognized as humanity's homeworld. The wreckage of the Indomitable was preserved exactly where it lay, visible from the settlement, a reminder of both sacrifice and survival. Construction accelerated. Babies were born, each one celebrated as a victory against extinction. Human culture spread through galactic space, music and art and stories that fascinated species who had forgotten what it meant to struggle for existence. Borum became humanity's first ambassador, though she refused to change her title from chief engineer. Taejin established a joint military academy, teaching tactics that no one wanted to use but everyone needed to know. Eunji founded the Terran Medical Institute, bridging the gap between species through healing. Kyungmin trained pilots in what became known as Terran dynamics, maneuvers that pushed the boundaries of physics and common sense. Hyunwoo received the Star of Valor, the highest honor the Talvin Empire could award. But he visited New Terra frequently, drawn not by duty but by friendship. He and Borum had become close through shared experience and mutual respect. They stood together at the memorial one evening, watching human children play in gardens beneath alien stars. Mireille joined them, no longer just a science officer, but a friend to both. She asked the question that troubled her. Would humans ever truly feel safe? Borum considered the question while watching the children. They were the first generation born off Earth, the first who would never know their homeworld. They played with both human and Talvin children, learning multiple languages, growing up in a galaxy that their parents had fought to join. She thought about everything humanity had lost and everything they had gained. Then she answered honestly. Safety wasn't what had kept humanity alive. Stubbornness had. Hope had. Each other had. They were abandoned in the void, left for dead by an enemy that thought extinction was permanent. Silence broke apart when someone found them. And from the dark, they emerged, not as victims, as survivors, and they were still here. Above them, the first human-designed warship launched from New Terra's orbital dock. Its hull bore both Terran and galactic markings, a symbol of alliance forged in fire, but it also carried human names. Indomitable. Doyun. Earth. Reminders of what was lost, and promises of what would never happen again. Humanity would never be helpless again. They had died, once, as a species. They had been given a second chance by sacrifice and luck and the kindness of strangers. They would not waste it. They would build. They would grow. They would remember. And if the darkness came again, they would be ready. Because humans didn't know how to quit. It wasn't in their nature. And the galaxy was finally beginning to understand what that meant.